So today I want to talk about selection of sound. Something that when I was starting out I wasn't quite getting, and recently talking to a lot of producers I've noticed how many times I'll say, well, why don't you just do this or that other thing with the sound. They'll just be like, I never thought of that, and it kind of surprises me. So I thought, hey, maybe I should make a video on that. Now, one thing I want to say right out the gate, I'm not the most technical or most musically proficient person. I mean, I haven't really had a lot of musical training, pretty much almost none. I'm probably gonna throw some terms here. Some professors are gonna roll their eyes at me, but that's fine. Really what I want to try to do is break down some methodology, ways to think about stuff when you're approaching it. So this is not gonna be, specific to one recording software or another. It's really just going to be what you might need to be thinking about that you haven't been thinking about if you're, a fairly new producer. Alright, so the first thing I want you to think about is the balance of your sound. You have everything from low end to high end and a lot of places in between that you need to get a balanced sound. So first, let's think about this like a piano. On the piano you have notes in the lower octaves and the higher octaves. You gotta think about this as you're arranging all the different instruments you want to have on the track. If we look at this from like a piano analogy, you would have your drums, for instance. You're gonna have your kick drum on the low end, your snare on the high end. You're gonna have a bass also down there in the low end. You may have a vocal up near the high end. You might have a piano somewhere in the mid-range and a sample that may cover multiple octaves within itself, because depending on what you're sampling, it could be the full spectrum. You need to think about how you lay these things out. Something just to keep as a visual, think like keys on a piano. If you've laid out some of your instruments and there's just too much here and too much there and not enough, say for instance in the middle, then it might end up sounding thin. So sometimes you have a sample, it's dominating a lot of space. So one of the things you may need to do, and you probably always should be doing, for instance with samples, is cutting some of the low and cutting some of the high. You basically take it in EQ and you bring it in on either side to take out some of those frequencies. A lot of the low is pretty obvious because you want to get rid of the kick drums and the bass so you can play your own. But cutting out the highs and how you cut them will allow space for the artist who's going to be singing or rapping on the song. It'll allow also space for other instruments to come into that place. You need to make space, essentially, is what you're trying to do here. Now let's look at another scenario. Sometimes when you're composing, you end up finding a bunch of instruments and you're playing them in octaves that are close to each other, or the way the synthesizer works, a lower octave sounds like a higher octave. Couple things that you should do, because sometimes you can get a lot of sounds that build up in the same frequency, and what will end up happening is they'll clash, they'll become very muddy. Change the octave for one of your instruments. The one that's like primary or has the best energy probably should stay in the octave that it felt best in, and other ones you should try to move into different octaves. Something else to try specifically when it comes to drums is to pitch. For instance, a lot of times I'll take a hi-hat and I'll pitch it up a semitone or down or two, and the same thing with the kick drum. It can give you a new flavor. For instance, with a kick drum, when you pitch it down, it can get a lot deeper, thicker, or just a little more subby. With hi-hat, especially with something that already has a lot of high sounds in it, like a lot of high frequency sounds, when you pitch it down, you're going to then kind of take it out of the range where it's hard to hear because of everything else that's going on. Sometimes it also gives it just a nicer feel or a grittier feel. It just depends on the hi-hat you're working with. And that can be applied to pretty much anything. One last thing that also to keep in mind, if you do have an instrument that you want to play in a very similar frequency, like similar octave as other instruments, because that's just what sounds best, but they are clashing a lot and it becomes very muddy and hard to really hear and things aren't distinct. If you're playing one, say your main primary instrument, and you're playing long sustained notes, then play the other one in shorter like staccato notes. Something so that it's more maybe playful, and so that one is coming in quickly and the other one is playing long, so that way you're not trying to hear them both. You get to hear that one for a second, your tension goes there, and then it comes back. Sometimes you'll get a sound that's really, really good, and it's just doesn't have enough warmth to it. For instance, many times I'll get like a synthesizer that just sounds really good on a high end frequency but doesn't have something on a low, and I don't want to play different chords. I want that thing to like be the meat of everything. You go and try to find another synthesizer that sounds very similar, or you take the exact same one, you play it simultaneously at the same time but in a lower octave, blend the two things together. It takes a lot of level balancing, figuring out like how loud each of the instruments should be. It also will take work in terms of maybe some EQ, but what you're trying to do is blend them together into be one thing. You can also go the approach of trying to have two sounds simultaneously playing left and right, very common with orchestras. You would have one wind instrument on one side and a different wind instrument on the other side, and those two sounds coming into either ear become kind of like one bigger thing. Additionally, you can also have another scenario where you're trying to put things in kind of like in front of each other. For instance, let's say it's play like a pluck sound, and then something else is playing off of it, but it's kind of subtle and low in the background, so like a plucked guitar and then kind of like a violin string playing behind it. You want them to sound both centered, not pan left and right. You want the one to be very upfront and forward with you, and the other one kind of farther back, maybe a more reverb-based sound and a lot quieter. They sound like they're kind of one instrument. You can kind of still distinctly tell there's kind of two things going on, and they're just playing with each other very much like in tandem. Other things you should be doing with stacking is your drums. Taking a couple of kick drums, putting them together, taking snares and putting them together. And that's also a good place to be pitch shifting. Take one kick and you would pitch it down and maybe cut out the highs, and another one you would leave just as it was. Sounds that are more reverb heavy are gonna sound like they're much further away, like, you know, the back of an orchestra, compared to those that are up front. So sometimes like you'll have a piano, and pianos can dominate a lot of frequencies, but when you have a reverb on it, it'll feel like it falls back, and that'll allow for things like your drums and your artists to come up front. Going into reverbs is a whole other conversation, and there's lots of tutorials on YouTube that break down, you know, how to apply reverb. But just keep in mind that when you're selecting sounds, sometimes you need some that are gonna feel up front and some that are gonna feel way far back, and reverb is a way to create that three-dimensional depth that makes things feel like when you're listening, it's way far away from you. Alright guys, if you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let me know that you like this. And if you hated it, let me know that too. I'm just trying to create some, you know, methodology, that stuff that, you know, if you're early on producing, I wish somebody had told me. So, yeah, let me know. Peace.